Welcome to the moment that changed everything, where we interview notable creative people to gain insights into how they got started and learn more about the moments that shaped them and their careers. Today we sit down with David Footman. David is currently a cinematic director at Ubisoft in Toronto, where he lends his craft to telling powerful stories to some of your favorite games, namely Far Cry 5, Splinter Cell Blacklist, and Assassin's Creed Unity.
Different people are getting different things out of games, and I think the biggest challenge we have right now is like this complete lack of disposable time. I mean, I make games and I fight like hell to get the time to play games.
He also did a stint at EA Sports, working on Need for Speed Shift, Godfather 2, From Russia with Love, Medal of Honor. Well, look, you get the picture. He's a stud. So have a listen, because there's a lot to learn, especially if you're making the transition from traditional film, did I mention before gaming, who worked on X-Men 3 and iRobot, to the world of gaming. Enjoy. David, welcome. Thanks for coming on. We've had other folks from Ubisoft on, but it's great to talk to you and your discipline today. Was at the industry night at Ubisoft, and you demoed the new motion capture space there, and it was just so amazing for someone like me who doesn't really know that world to actually see it in action. So that was fantastic. At the time that we were introduced, though, you were talking to someone, and I was just on the periphery listening to you, and you looked like positively giddy about, and I want to say it was about a new form of console, gaming console. And I don't know if you're allowed to talk about it, but tell me a little bit about it, because you just seem so excited about it.
Yeah, so there are two new consoles coming out in 2020 for PlayStation and for Xbox. In addition to that, Stadia launched like a month ago, I think, or 3 weeks ago. And so there's going to be a streaming platform. I know Apple has a platform now for gaming. So 2020 proves to be like a pretty insane year for games and consoles and for the dev industry. Every time, what we've seen in the last 10 years, every time a new console comes out, there's just an explosion of creativity and content, and so it's great for everybody. So it's sort of like a feast of content. So we were presented all the specs and details on the new consoles, and there's a sniper probably following me around town right now, waiting for me to say the wrong thing, because we're under a pretty strict NDA. There are even people at my own company that aren't allowed to actually know the specs of the new consoles, but since we're already designing games for those consoles, there's a ton of people that have to know the ins and outs. So what I can say is that between the new consoles and Stadia, it's a game changer in terms of how we make games and how we deliver games. So a lot of the barriers that we've had in the past, I think, are dropping, and I think what you're going to see is a broader ecosystem of games, kind of what you've seen in film in the last 20, 30 years with big, huge blockbusters, like can't fail blockbusters coming out in July, and then you don't see a lot of competition around that. I kind of see the opposite. I kind of see with the new consoles and with Stadia and with all these other platforms, this whole new ecosystem of games that are in the mid-range and even smaller games, sort of satellite games that float around the big releases. And the reason it excites me is that you're going to get a lot more diversity. You're going to get a lot more experimentation. You're going to get a lot more innovation, I guess, in games, because we're going to be making smaller footprint games, cheaper games that are going to be allow us to take risks and tell different kinds of stories. As I said, with the technology that's coming out, it's kind of like taking the shackles off. So we're going to be able to tell really different kinds of stories, and this kind of touches multiplayer. It touches streaming. It touches how fast, how quickly content loads. Even thinking about something you take for granted in film and television or commercials. You can jump locations. I could be in Paris and I'll be in New York. I'm watching either a montage or I'm watching an opening sequence, right, where you're intercutting between all these characters. If you work in open world games like I have for the last 5 or 10 years, you'll know that it's all happening at runtime. So the engine is creating these worlds and these characters moment to moment at runtime based on choices you made in the game. So it's very difficult to suddenly jump 100 feet away, or I'll say 100 meters away to something else, and show that full screen without sort of a load time and so forth. So there's all this sort of, and I'm really getting down to like talking about storytelling. So as a storyteller, if I wanted to do that sort of an intercutting sequence, showing things happening in 3 different places, it wouldn't actually be possible at runtime. And I think that what we're seeing now is maybe with new advances in technology, especially in streaming, like what you're already seeing in Google Stadia. I mean, they're doing all the processing, all the rendering on their servers. So you're going to be able to do things you couldn't do in games. So I think that's just like one kind of idea that I think is going to change how we tell stories. But it just what we've seen in the past is with new consoles, it's an explosion of new content and different kinds of content, which is exciting.
When you say cheaper game, you mean cheaper to produce?
Yeah, like I think that. I mean, when games are $200 or $300 million to make, and you're making them over 5 years, the stakes are so high. It's hard to take creative risks on those games. Many studios do, but I'll say some studios do, but you don't see as much creative risks happening. And so I'm hopeful that you're going to see sort of more middle-sized games where we can really, try different concepts, tell different kinds of stories. I think a lot of, when I first started working in gaming, it was like we were all inspired by film and television. We watched a lot of media. And so we were trying in some ways to emulate some of those experiences we had. But I think it's an opportunity for us. I think you're seeing it already to be trailblazers. Like we're actually defining a whole style of narrative and storytelling. And I mean, the industry is so big now, I feel like we're already doing that. But just to be our own, to make our own mark, you know what I mean?
Well, I know, one of the questions I had for you I was going to ask later, but since we're on the subject, you come from more of a traditional, clearly, film background. And, my question revolves around, making this transition from a traditional filmic background to gaming. And I know, the spine, what's carried over, I'm sure, is it's storytelling, but using different tools. But what are the biggest obstacles from going from a traditional filmic background and then getting into gaming and knowing the limitations of both, I guess?
Yeah, I would say having an understanding of CG and the pipelines and workflows around that would be the hardest thing. I was fortunate in that I was an assistant director, so I got into the film industry in would have been like early 90s. I was very young, and I was very, very ambitious. So I worked really hard at sort of trying to move up the ladder as quickly as I could. And it was at a time when the industry in Vancouver was just exploding. And by the time I think I was 28 years old, I was a first assistant director because it was so busy, they had no choice but to hire me. I was like the youngest first assistant director, I think, at the time, doing like motorcycle stunts onto a BC ferry, somewhere, and people look at me, and I looked really young at the time. They're like, "Who's this kid running the show here?" And so I got in really young, but I had a penchant for CG and visual effects. I noticed that sort of early on. I was really fascinated by the magical qualities that you could bring with green screen, set extensions, like compositing and all that. So, and we were starting to do that on some of the films I was working on. I think that the biggest VFX film I worked on was Dreamcatcher. So that was Larry Kasdan was directing, Morgan Freeman, and we had a lot of CG, a lot of set extensions, a lot of CG characters. And I was on the second unit for that, so I did all the aerials, I did all the CG, I did the visual effects, and working with I worked with a stunt director, I worked with a visual effects director from Industrial Light and Magic. So I definitely got really excited and interested in what you could do in CG in film, and so already I was really excited about it. And I started searching out films that had a lot of CG in them because I was very interested in them, and I understood it, and I ended up working. When I'd work on larger films, sometimes I'd be a second AD working for an old school first AD, who would have been from, born in the 50s, didn't really understand CG, so he'd be like the militant sort of like running the set, ruling everything, and I'd come in and teach him how to break stuff down and shoot it in CG. So that was pretty much X-Men 1. I worked with Don French, and I got to help break down all the CG for that. Like all of the sequences required a lot of like physical effects, CG effects, and all that. So I was really good at breaking that stuff down, understanding how we would schedule it, putting it on a call sheet, and sort of explaining it to everybody. So that really set me up for my transition into games. And so I was in that sort of visual effects track, and the transition film was iRobot, the Will Smith picture with the robots. And they brought me in very last minute, and like just scrambling to set up a performance capture unit for the film. Because I guess a lot of the vendors had like a clause in their contracts that said, look, we bid this much to do the film, but we require performance capture data that's actually married to the live action data. So any scene you'd see Will Smith in that he was walking with a robot, they required mocap data that matched spatially to that. So we put a unit together. We were sort of coming in on the tail of first unit, going in and shooting robots and tying it in using click tracks and all kinds of other methods. And that was a huge learning curve for me. And I met my mentor on that project, and that kind of what propelled me into set me up for success in video games.
Interesting. So at that time, were there a lot of other guys that were as into CG and making that their discipline at the time, or were you a very attractive person to have on because you were one of the few?
Yeah, there weren't many people, and you couldn't learn it.
Yeah, you were just getting your hands dirty and learning on the fly.
That was it, and I was reading Cinefex. So the fastest way to learn about CG and visual effects back then was reading the periodicals, the Cinefex that came out I don't know, it came out every month or every 3 months, and just meeting people on sets because it was changing so quickly. Like I remember we had Encodicam on iRobot, which was this sort of rudimentary way of tracking the camera and actually compositing in real-time sets so that you could frame your shots and see the set extensions. And so the director really wanted that. And so now, of course, we're doing incredible things like that live. But you just had to kind of figure it out as you went along and go and study it like yourself, just learning through whichever way you could.
So when you meet your mentor, was that person's background similar to yours, or was it completely different? So did you go from like having like you were the guy that knew the most in this world, but then you went into a new world where you were dwarfed by somebody who had way more knowledge?
Yeah, I think at the time I was really good at breaking down scripts, and I was really good at as an assistant director understanding CG. So when I moved over to iRobot, that was kind of the first time I'd ever met somebody who came from like a completely different background. It's pure animation and keyframe animation. But they work, of course, keyframe / you're also animating in Maya as well. So it's assisted keyframe animation. I met Andy Jones on iRobot in the first week, and the first thing I asked for was, okay, well, I want to go down to LA with Andy and see what's going on in this pipeline in post-production at ILM. So that was down in Venice Beach, Digital Domain, that little campus down there. And I went down there, and it just sort of blew my mind. I was just like, oh my God. I mean, it was the first time I'd ever seen animation in Maya. So Andy set me up on a computer there with Maya, with an animation of a biped climbing a wall. And I was just like, I scrolled it back and forth, and I thought, oh my God, how are they doing this? This is incredible. And that was motion capture data they'd captured early on. So I became really close friends with Andy, so I learned a lot when I was down in LA. And so at the time, I was kind of inventing a pipeline for performance capture in film, in the sense that I got my own edit suite next to all the other editors. I was bringing in all the sort of the nonlinear edits from the editors, and figuring out our click tracks and timing for where we needed to put our CG robots in. And, it was figuring out what's the process for quickly figuring out what we need, what's the spatial requirements, how do we build it quickly, what's going to be keyframe, what's going to be performance capture data, all that stuff. And then also, like, at the time working in that technology, there was a lot of sort of, I would call them like yahoos that were motion capture companies. We originally had a motion capture company that didn't really know what they were doing and had kind of like a rock concert set up with scaffolding, and it looked great. But then when we got the data back, it was really noisy, and the retargeting to the skeletons didn't look very good at all. There was a lot of show, but not a lot of I don't know what you'd say, just not a lot of go or craft. Yeah. So we ended up firing them and bringing in another company. I think we ended up hiring Motion Analysis down in Culver City, and we were setting up 15 by 15 foot volumes in, like, they'd fly up with the cameras and set it up when we were doing our shoots. Creating our own process and pipeline to catch up to the live action on set, because vendors were waiting for this data. It had a really tight timeline. It was really exciting because I felt like I was on the cutting edge. I was learning something that I thought that I didn't think anybody else knew how to do. I got to work with editors. At the time, I was editing my own sort of shorts and indie stuff. So it was allowing me to do everything that I've been learning to do over the past 15 years. And I love CG so much, it was like merging everything. Mm. So, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the storytelling aspect of what you do. I mean, I think about film, I think about actors, I think about their relationship with one another, and they're human beings. And then you're thrust in. You're part of this world where I'm neophyte, right? So, but I look at it and I think, well, they're all separated. Like, you're shooting physical aspects of characters, but then there's voiceover. And what happens when you separate those two things? I know that the end product is very good, but that's a totally separate thing.
Yeah, when I first started doing performance capture for video games, that was the process. I called it karaoke acting. So you would record the audio, you would get the takes just right, you would take that onto set and do a click track and match body animation to it. So you're kind of like karaoke acting on stage. It's kind of at the time I was surprised that's how it was done, mm-hmm. because it was not super unified, like in terms of the performance. You could feel that it wasn't quite right in the data when you saw the final product. So it's really hard. Like, that is one of the hardest things I think you can do, is record the audio and do the body data, sure. and the facials separately. To bring it all together, you need to be like a master chef. And I rarely try it, because right as I was getting into the games industry, we started unifying all of those. So doing face, body, and voice all at the same time, so that on stage, it's all together. It's only when things kind of go sideways and we're doing reshoots or replacing actors that we get into a position where we're having to, like, record the voice later and assign it to the character. And then you're getting into, like, you have to really be a master chef to know how to time it out, because essentially what you've got in performance capture is you've got body data, so that's captured off of the marker suit. You've got audio from dialogue, which is captured off a lavalier and a boom microphone, and then you've got facial data. And depending on your pipeline, it's usually optical. So there'll be a couple of cameras pointed at your face and then markers on your face. And then we have software that learns how to retarget that onto a face rig. So all of those are kind of happening at the same time. Because of the technology, it's possible to go, let's say I shot a scene, I could go back 2 weeks later and just put a helmet camera on the same actor and change some of the lines. And I call that face replacement or head replacement. As long as it was in sync with what I did on stage, it would work. But if it was off by even half a second, when you're looking at the performance, the eye tracking is off a little bit. There's something kind of strange about it, mm-hmm. And I think that we're able to actually, like, I've read somewhere that we're able to measure like up to 3,000 expressions on a human face. So I think there's a lot of emotion and there's a lot of story happening in the character's face that we're not even aware of. So when you start sort of like rebuilding it from scratch, things start falling apart. And I think it's like a cumulative errors start coming in where it doesn't feel real. I mean, it has to feel human. It has to feel, you have to feel the humanity in the character. So I think the first thing I did when I started in video games was fight really hard to unify that, because it was one less thing I had to worry about. I mean, it's hard enough to direct an actor and to find the authenticity and to find something that doesn't break the character, or something that feels not false, something that feels real. Like, I mean, this is all in the craft, right? But if you get that and you're trying to assemble it from 3 different things, like you could fall down in 3 other areas. So it's just like adding too much risk to the overall performance. So I fought really hard to unify it. I would say like 95% of what I shoot is unified performance. So I don't even have to worry about it.
Wow. Yeah, because I was going to ask. I mean, I think, when we think about the more traditional film, we think of big name stars, and we think about it's what you're talking about, but in a human form, or it doesn't have this layer of so like, when does that start happening, or has it already happened?
You mean like bringing in sort of recognizable names?
Yeah, like with the bodysuit, with all the plot points and all that kind of stuff, and is that coming soon? Is it already happening?
Already, yeah.
It already is.
I'd say it's been happening for quite a long time. There's a lot of it going on. Like you'll see it in the Call of Duty games. You'll see it on a lot of titles where they'll bring in a name actor to do a performance. And I think that, like, if they're prepared properly, the performance translates fine. And what you'll notice is that you look at film and television right now, there is a ton of performance capture already happening in that. Like any of the Marvel films, there are digital doubles for all the characters, right? And those are sort of authored either by a stunt actor in a PCAP suit or the actor on a separate stage. So it's happening already. So it's not like big, huge name stars aren't getting into the PCAP suit already. It's happening everywhere. So it's definitely part of the process, especially when you get into these big budget sort of Marvel Hollywood films that require digital doubles and like CG characters.
Right. I know one of my questions was, and I did ask this of Cameron and Patrick both when they were on, is, in a world where anything can happen, whether or not that's a freeing thing, or does it make life more difficult for you? I mean, we talked about traditional filming and stuff, and you have your location, and those are set places, where I see the world of gaming as it can be anything, and that seems kind of frightening. It's frightening for me to think about, but how is it for you in your discipline?
Yeah, it can be paralyzing when you don't have constraints. And I think it's kind of well known right now that sometimes, I don't know, like there's a story I heard about a really famous pianist, Keith Jarrett. He's a jazz pianist. And I think he was playing a show in Paris, and the piano was damaged on the way to the show. And he could only, the bottom like 11 or 12 keys were toast. And the top of the piano, like the high notes, were toast. And he's a really particular guy. If you go to one of his concerts, if someone like coughs the wrong way, he'll stop and look at you and be like, "What are you doing?" And so he went to his manager. He said, "Look, I'm not playing the show. Just forget it. This is it. Get me another piano." And the manager said, "You're playing the show. You're playing on that piano. I can't get another one in time. You just got to deal with it." And so he played it, right? And what was that? That was Cologne. It's a really famous concert called the Cologne Concert, Part 1 and Part 2. Became his most famous recording ever. Like, it dwarfed anything else he ever did. And he played in a completely different way because he couldn't play the piano the way he wanted. He was constrained. And I was like, wow, he made the most beautiful art ever. Like, they're 2 of my favorite songs. So I think, like, it can be bewildering sometimes to be on a game and have no constraints. So we have to create them. Otherwise, it's just, you just kind of freeze up and get lost. And which means like having really, really clear lenses and creative direction when you're looking at the game, because truthfully, you can do just about anything. Meaning it's a very malleable world. There's not a lot of physical constraints as to what you can do. But what I find is that if you really sort of sit down in your fundamentals, and work with like less ingredients, you're often able to tell a better story, just because you don't get lost.
Sure. And I think that's when it comes to creative vocations, I think that's very true. A more tightly defined situation, and then exploring creativity within that seems a way less daunting than this open season on stuff. In terms of the themes and the ideation for games, how much of that is driven by directors? In other words, like, do you have ideas for games that you bring forth, or is it more like we have this idea that's been it's in its infancy, and we're going to need you to execute it? Because I think of the traditional world of film as a lot of directors coming to the table and wanting to do something and express
Totally.
creativity.
Yeah, it's really different in games. Like so that's not something that I do. I don't pitch games. I don't come in with ideas for games. So I'm an expert for performance capture, storytelling, realization, and so forth. So the way it normally works is there'll be like a project will be in early conception with probably a creative director, a game director, a very small core team. And then once they have a concept for the game that is fun and makes sense in the market that we have now, then I'll be brought on, and I'll generally work with the creative director. If there's a head writer there, I'll work with them, or I'll hire a head writer, or be part of the decision that brings in the right kind of head writer. So there's and the other thing that we've seen in the last 10 years is it used to be like a head writer and a bunch of other writers. Now what we have is we have a narrative director, because the narrative in games is so complex and it's become so moment to moment in gameplay. You need to have somebody that's super sharp at understanding game design to know how to inject story into moment to moment gameplay, not just someone who knows how to write a great screenplay.
Right.
So succinct, efficient dialogue is something that people spend years and years and years learning to do really well. That's a really specific discipline. I would have a writer that just does that, or sometimes we bring in a consultant that helps, tidy up dialogue. But the meat and potatoes of it is like a narrative director and a bunch of other writers that are writing, tens of thousands of lines that happen in the game, moment to moment, that are creating a world, that are reacting to players' actions in the game, because it's causal, right? Mm-hmm. The stories that are most important, I think, in games right now are causal stories that players feel like, well, I did this and now I'm getting a different story. It's personalizing the experience. So when I come on, for an open world game, I'll be working with a narrative director, a lot with the creative director. On some games, we even have a separate realization director whose focus is sort of that player experience with respect to cameras and visual effects and so forth. I tend to do realization, cinematics, and story all together. So I kind of handle all three and have everybody on my team.
Well, how do you define realization? What does that mean?
Realization is kind of like tuning all of the story channels outside of like the cinematic. So what would be like a scripted event that happens in game. It would be some music that swells up as you go into a certain part of a set. It would be choosing perhaps a time of day. Realization would be like changes you make to the gameplay camera. It's really it's like an experience. It's an experienced director that touches like color, sound, camera, focal length, like trying to create more emotion in. It's a mix between an art director and a cinematic director and an editor. Tempo, timing. It's very new as well. So narrative director and realization director are two very new positions that I've seen show up a lot. Because we're looking for the pizzazz, we're looking for wow moments, we're looking for people that understand how to create emotion with the craft, like with the tools.
It's and again, I keep going back to this comparison. I guess I don't have anything else to compare it to, but theater goers or movie goers go into a space and they sit in front of a screen, and then the director and the people involved in making the film then tell you the story, and you're passive in that. You're just taking in that data, and you're sitting back. And then in the gaming, you have this totally other experience where you're part of it, or you're I don't know even how to describe what that is. You're not, I guess, in total control of it, but you are to a certain extent.
Yeah.
How does telling a story change when the person sitting watching and experiencing it is part of it or immersed in it? How does that even work?
It's that's probably why it's so hard for people to move from movies, film, and television into games.
Mm-hmm.
It is one of the most complicated things you can ever face. And within gaming, there's a spectrum. Like there's some games, like for instance, God of War, which is a very single player, you're on rails, and it's a lot easier to tell story in that kind of environment because we know there's a path. It's like how do you take a script and shuffle it and still tell a story? And there's no beginning, middle, or end anymore. So that's been sort of the big challenge, I think, in gaming. And so the philosophy at my studio is that we're really pushing into player-driven stories, which is there's a lot of stories in the world. So we call that world storytelling. And players go out and discover the stories that they want to discover. But we also have an element of logic and causality within all of those characters so that depending on what the player does in the world, will change the kind of feedback and stories they get from those characters. So that's the most powerful feeling you can have in a game is when you feel like I am here and everyone's reflecting back who I am because of the changes that I'm making in the world, because of how I'm interacting in this world. So storytelling has a lot of logic and causal elements to it in gaming that are super complicated to execute on. That these are using systems, these are using libraries of say, imagine having a gesture library for a bunch of characters, and then we would be able to trigger different lines depending on what the player did. And this is something that I've been sort of developing over the past 10 years is high-end AAA cinematics with logic embedded in them so that characters that you care about, characters that are playing the archetypes in the game, they're gonna say, I see you, and they're expressing back to the player actions they've taken in the game. So that I think is the most powerful feeling you can have in a game, and that's kind of where all of our storytelling might is going right now in open world storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, just if we could just look at someone watching a film and seeing what they're experiencing themselves, and then compare that to then gaming, I look at that and I go, wouldn't that be unbelievable? Like if I'm watching a film and I'm so immersed in it, and I think about the films that I've seen that elicited that kind of emotional response. I mean, Tom Hanks in Philadelphia in that moment, and you're bawling. Will there be a time in the future where I will be immersed in a game and I will have that kind of, I don't know, connection to characters?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people who've played The Last of Us, which was a single-player game, came out, 10 years ago, would say that's the experience. That's the experience I had. That's the experience a lot of people had. So it's a bit of a outlier in terms of execution, craft. It was a masterpiece. So when I played the game, I couldn't stop thinking like, geez, like this is something I want to do. Like I want to be able to create, we call it the feels in player. And it's just using dramatic structure, right? That everyone in film and television understands. I mean, even if you just like go watch the opening of Joker, right? The new film. In the first 7 minutes, it's just masterful, right? I mean, they create empathy, they create emotion. The feels is really strong. Mm-hmm. You understand the character. Like you have to do that in games.
Yeah, and it's hard for me to think that way, only because it's the immersive nature of gaming that I think is we talked a little bit about this before we started recording. There's that phenomenon that happens where you're so immersed in something that you lose time, and that I think in the gaming world is something that I would say it probably happens to everyone. That's not necessarily the experience when it comes to watching movies and watching stories all the time. But with game, I guess because you're trying to achieve something, it takes you away into that world such that I don't know if it, does that disconnect you from the emotional aspect? I mean, I think when I think about gaming, and again, like for me, it's tough because I'm not part of that scene that much, and I don't play a lot of games. But it's almost like it would cut off that being able to empathize or really, really understand the feelings going on, because you've got this other part of your brain that's functioning, which is I'm trying to achieve something.
Right. I think there's a really interesting relationship between the player and their avatar and identity. This identity, which is something you feel like this every day. Like you have an identity and you express it, and people validate your identity when you talk to them, your friends and family or whatever. But I think when you're designing a video game, you have like a cast of characters in the game. Then you've got a player avatar, which is like a stand-in for player's identity. You're writing with another character in mind. It's the player, right? To create sort of a feeling or emotion. I think absolutely, if you don't have a strong character need in a video game, then people just aren't going to play it. They put it down, and they have lots of data on this. Game testing, where they'll show like some games will come out and very few people finish games. But games that don't have the hook, that don't create the character need early on. When I say character need, that's the need of the avatar that you've created. If there isn't a strong need, then people drop off super early, like 5 hours in, and they're gone. And so I think what the data shows is that people are really immersed. People are emotional, but for different reasons sometimes, because you've got completionists, you've got people that are really into collecting things, you've got people that we call immersed story writers that want to have sort of a character experience, an emotional experience with these characters outside of their avatar. So we've definitely been able, well, I mean, you can break down as many different kinds of people as you like, but we've done a lot of work at figuring out the different sort of kinds of people who play games and what they get out of them. And I mean, sometimes I'm on the subway and I'll look over at somebody, in mid-40s businessman playing Candy Crush, right? And I'm like, and I don't play Candy Crush, but I'm always amazed. I'm like, wow, like, what is he getting out of that? Like, is it mastery? Is it a puzzle he's solving? Is it about? And it's interesting, like, different people are getting different things out of games. And I think the biggest challenge we have right now is like this complete lack of disposable time. I mean, it's like for me anyway, I make games and I fight like hell to get the time to play games. Look what's happened with Netflix and Hulu and Disney Plus. Like there's so much content everywhere that I still think that what you're seeing in gaming right now is incredible stories. Like the technology is allowing us to do really amazing things, and we're still on this old console generation. And like stories that, because you're adding in this identity and this sort of this causality, I think it's a totally different kind of storytelling, different experience. And I do believe that's why it's gotten so huge. Like, I mean, it's like I don't know if I've memorized the numbers exactly, but I think it's the size of the film, the TV, and the music industry combined, or something like that.
Ridiculous.
It's a lot of gaming.
Yeah. I mean, talk to Patrick a little bit about this too. And I'm sure the studios or whatever look at the targeting of like who they're talking to, and to your point, designing games that appeal to those types of people. I think everybody has this idea in their mind of who those people might be. And maybe it's safe to say that when you see the plethora or the types of games that are out there, you are talking to a certain person. But like, as I said to him, like, could there be a time where it's completely romantic, and that's the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I'll double back and ask you this question, because when I go back to, how do you balance the passive aspects of the games? Because I remember growing up in a time where, you'd skip that stuff, right? Like the dialogue between the characters. Yeah, let's get to the shooting.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And people would just skip that or whatever, and kind of go, Yeah, and I guess so. And so like, is there are you balancing that more, or is there a need and people want more of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we do, what my team does anyway, we look. I mean, cinematics. So that's kind of how I got into this business, with cinematics. So performance capture being my secret power, and then cinematics. I would say, like, in most games now, the amount of the cinematics account for like less than 5% of all the content in the game that actually tells story.
Wow, really?
Right. It'll be in every trailer. It'll be up front when the game is being sold, when we're creating an identity for the game or branding the game. But it really is less than 5%. There's so much more storytelling in the game that is occupied by different channels, whether they're scripted events in game, whether they're events that happen in just dialogue only from a character, whether it's environmental storytelling, lighting, whether it's like you find like a wreckage of something that's telling a story. So like we're constantly trying to push story out of cinematics and into those other channels to create more of a symphony, because that's exactly it. Like nobody wants to have a story told to them. They want, so we're trying to move the story into those other channels. So when you get to a cinematic, we use it for what's really important, which is the feels, where we create an emotion. I mean, it just comes down to like primal storytelling. Nothing is ever, it's not changing. All the best stories are primal storytelling, period. There's nothing else that is beating out great primal storytelling. So if we just use our cinematics to reveal character and connect to primal emotions, that really drive us to feel things, then we're going to create moving sort of experiences and evoke wonder in players, because you're going to be creating the symphony. I think that's really it. I'm crazy focused on craft right now, because you see when it's done well in film and television and on a game, and it is a number of people that have to come together with it, with craft, with expertise in dramatic function, psychological functions. Like you look at Joseph Campbell, like the work he's done on defining what a hero is and the archetypes. I feel like the maturity that's required now in gaming is for everyone who's authoring games to understand those basic fundamentals of storytelling, and understand, like, stories are basically a way for us to understand what it is to be human. And so the games are also an expression of that. I mean, at their base level, it has to be that. So the more we understand that, the more we can actually use the craft to create better experiences. And that's kind of where I want to get to now. Like, I want to leverage all those learnings from film and television, even though we're such a different medium, to create stronger experiences.
Yeah, like I think I'll ask you this question, because I think most people still look at them as separate worlds, but are the worlds coming together, or do you think they'll always be separate? In other words, I'm talking about the traditional film world, or is someone going to be walking up the steps at the Oscars that's the author of a game, or will that ever happen?
Yeah, like I feel like, well, put it this way. When I got into the games industry, a lot of other people from film and television jumped over. So that was like back in the 90s. So there were a lot of compositors, a lot of directors, people that were joining joining the games industry, and not very many lasted. And for like lots of reasons. Super complex. The results are really hard to get, and story back then wasn't super mature. So it was kind of like, just do a bunch of stories, and they don't necessarily connect to what you're doing in the game, and so on. And the tech really wasn't there yet. So a lot of them sort of fell off. But I do believe that what we're seeing now as we mature in this industry, we're getting better pipelines, better workflows. We're telling more personal stories, which you don't see in film and television, although Netflix has got an interactive show now, right? So they're kind of getting into the interactive story telling space. I think, if anything, the way that I hope games are maturing right now is that we're telling stories using better craft. I think that we share that with film, television, and commercials. Like, we share these dramatic and psychological functions which make behavior and create emotion and help us understand what it is to be human. We all share that. So I think that we have that obligation, and that we have that in common with all the other mediums. But with the added sort of, I have this extra character in my story called the player. And depending on what kind of game it is, like it could be a player who creates an avatar, right? It could be a player who occupies an authored character, which is much easier to write a story for. But how can I write a story for player if they could have been like a 12th level monk with unlimited free fall, or I'm actually going to be a military type character who's an assault type character or heavy. Like these are radically different kinds of characters. How can one set of dialogue work for all of them? And it can't, right? So for that kind of game, you require systems, complex sort of, whether it's like algorithms to change dialogue or tweak kinds of dialogue that fit the archetype, and or just recording crazy amounts of dialogue under different voices to match that. So I think that's kind of like what we're looking at now in storytelling. We make a lot of sacrifices to allow the player to personalize their avatar and create the character they have. And when I say we make a lot of sacrifices, it's really hard to tell great stories when I don't know who the hero is. So that's what we're learning how to do right now.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I think about that. It's just incredible. And I don't know. I guess at the end of the day, I think of all of this stuff as escapism. Like I heard someone say not long ago that like how important dreaming is for people. Like if you don't dream, you'll die. And in a way, I see that these worlds that are created and this escapism, and it's such a human need to be able to, I guess, press time out on everything and then immerse yourself in this thing. But yeah, I mean, I think how difficult it must be. You have two heroes in a way, right? Like you're trying to serve two people. That must be insanely difficult. And what about you? Like, do you still like to take the more passive route and watch films, or are you always sort of looking at film as a way to leverage what you're doing now in games?
Yeah, like I'm very much into watching film and television. With the disposable time that I have, which is hardly any right now. Very much like I'm a DGA member. I get my screeners every year. Like Christmas is my favorite time of year because I get to watch all the Academy Award nominated films. But I'm getting them now, and it's just incredible to be able to see this, to see those films and be inspired by the storytelling. So I still feel like that's kind of like, it's always been my secret power anyway in video games, that I worked in film and television for many, many years, and that I could help game teams put sort of fantastical sequences together for their games to create really incredible experiences for players. So I feel like that's kind of my bread and butter right now at like shooting, like storyboarding, shooting, and then post-production, like putting together these crazy sequences. That's sort of my bread and butter. And I get a lot of inspiration from film and television, just like the stories that we're seeing out there. And like especially with this like proliferation of platforms for content now, like there's stuff that never would have been made, right? Like 5-10 years ago, like Netflix shows, Amazon shows, like there's just stuff that wouldn't have been made. And that's kind of how I see gaming, the changes I see to gaming, and I'm hoping happen in gaming in the next year as we start being able to play on anything. Like we're gonna have consoles, we're gonna have streaming, but there's so many more ways to play games. Like with Stadia right now, you can play on your TV, you can play on your phone, you can carry it with you everywhere. So I feel like that's going to allow us to distribute games in an easier way, and to make games that wouldn't have been possible to make because the profile would be too risky, right? So it has to be this blockbuster game. It has to be. And the other thing is, like, I think it's what I learn a lot from film and television is really understanding your genres. Like, this is something that games does really well is understanding what is your genre, like what is your audience expecting from your brand. It's super key. There's some anytime you know what genre you are and you add a little mix from another genre, it's very innovative, but you have to be really careful how you do it because audiences expect a certain thing. And I've learned that through film and television. But I'll sort of contradict myself. I just watched, what was it, Parasite, the film that came out of South Korea, totally mixing genres. Like I was just completely blown away by the film. Like I wasn't ready for how I walked out of that film and I was exhausted. And I was like, wow, look what they're doing. And so it's a sign that the director mastered all of those genres. And sort of it's something that I think would be really cool to see in gaming, is somebody with a complete mastery over the genres and can be like a maestro for the player to create all these new kinds of experiences that they've never had before in a game. That kind of excites me.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you, what when you sit down and you think and fantasize and dream about what you could do, is there something that you have clear in your mind that you would love to do?
Oh God. I think what I want to do is I want story to almost seem invisible within the game around gameplay. So it doesn't feel like it's a lot of like the way it was even a few years ago. You'd be playing the game and then you'd hit something, you'd fade to black, come up and there's a story. Somebody would go get a beer, check your phone, come back, go back in. So it was really structured so that this is story time, this is gameplay time. And I think what I would really love to be a part of is a game where it's never safe to put down the controller. You can pause it whenever you want because there's always something happening. There's always something stimulating. The story is actually part of the gameplay. You don't feel like it turns on or off. It's just completely part of the experience. And so that excites me. I also love doing opening sequences for games. Like I think it's like super fun, exciting, energetic. We did the opening sequence for Far Cry 5 last year, or was it a year and a half ago? No, it was last year. And we kind of went all in. We rented a giant gimbal, like piston-driven hydraulic gimbal to make a helicopter platform. A motion platform that is a helicopter. We built speed rail all around it, and we had this thing flying all around the volume, throwing people off. It was such a fun and exciting action-adventure experience. Like, to me, I always want to push that. Whenever I get on a game, I'm like, okay, what did we do? How can we do something better? How can we push the limits of what this stunt's going to look like or this action's going to look like? I mean, I get really excited about creating new experiences and pushing everyone to make something that isn't an imitation of something you saw in film, but something that is like totally new. So I mean, that's kind of what excites me now, especially with our new volume that we just built. We've got super incredible height, a lot of space, some new technology in it, and it would be great to sort of really push the bounds to actually surprise players.
I ask all of my guests the same question, which is, if there's someone watching this now or listening to it now that wants to do what you've done in your career, what's the best advice that you can give them?
I think something that I wish I'd done earlier was tune into my bliss. And I was living my life for other people, for expectations that other people had on me, for my dad and for society and whatever it was. I went to University of Western Ontario for 3 years studying something that I wasn't going to actually use. And it just took me a long time to actually sit down and figure out what it is that I want to do and make me happy, because I was so busy making everybody around me happy or doing what I thought people expected of me. So that would be the first thing. When I meet somebody who's like 18 or 19 and they seem to have conviction and know what they want to do, I'm just in awe because I so wasn't there. And I know that's my journey and that's the way it happened for me, but I wished I had tuned into that earlier in my life. The other thing is, I guess once you figure out what you want or what you're going to do, there really isn't anything that can stop you from getting it. Like, there really isn't. I mean, a lot of people will sort of be a victim in their life and be like, oh, this didn't work out, that didn't work out for me. I think when I finally ended up like I dropped out of Western and finished like 10 years later. When I finally decided I was going to do it, I was chasing this dream of like being a director. I didn't know why I wanted to be a director, but I knew there was something that stirred deep inside me. And I just went out to Vancouver and just started banging on doors. I got into the union as a trainee. I was basically crashing sets at 6 o'clock in the morning, volunteering. I was like watching parking lots for free, like on. I'm trying to think what movie that was. It was like it was a dog movie. I can't remember what it was, but on Little Women, I was following the film crew around in a station wagon, sleeping in the back, volunteering every morning to see if I could get on set. And eventually, they hired me, and some luck happened, and someone left, and I became the training assistant director. So I think you have to be willing to fight for what you want and just keep pursuing it. You'll get it if you just keep trying. And then the other thing I think is just like, don't think of education as being done when you're done. I think there's so much we have to learn while we're executing on this craft, whether it's film or television or gaming. There's so much you have to learn along the way that you really help yourself out by studying and learning and reading along the way to get new skills, or I heard someone call it a skill stack. Keep expanding your skill stack. That has really helped me along the way to sort of reinvent myself several times, over in the games industry, because I wanted to be more involved with story. But, I was never a writer. I hadn't gone to film school. So it was something that I had to do on my own, and it actually has been the best thing I've done in games, is to learn how to be a better writer and actually go out and write and study the masters and read all the books about writing screenplays. It's really helped me with my craft as a cinematic director, even though I'm not going to become a head writer, but just understanding it from that perspective really helped. Just like I think back to the first thing, which is just like really understanding what your bliss is. That's super hard for some people. It was really hard for me to look inward and be like, okay, this is what's going to make me happy, and this is why, I'm going to get up every day and do this, because I guess when you're inspired, everyone knows what to do, right?
Yeah, it's a good way to wrap up our conversation here, although we could have talked for a lot longer, is that when I first met you, I was watching you talk about the consoles, and you were positively giddy. Like you were like so excited. And so I guess there's something to be said for what you're talking about now, because if it is about that, then I think that you're probably very much in the right place. So thanks for coming on. I feel like I learn more and more about your world every time I have somebody from Ubisoft on, especially people as talented as you. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
This episode has been brought to you by the National Advertising Challenge, North America's only brief-based challenge that sends winners to Cannes, France.